Chapter 13, Distributing and Promoting Products. In the last session, we looked at the 4 P's of marketing, specifically product, price, place or distribution, and promotion or communication. Chapter 12 focuses a little bit more detail on the first 2 P's, product and price, and I hope you do take the time to read that chapter. Because we've got some time constraints, we're skipping that, going straight on to Chapter 13, which covers distribution and promotion. And I'm going to narrow it still further for now and just look at the promotion or communication element. Now, one of the most important concepts in promotion is the idea of IMC, or Integrated Marketing Communications. And this is the idea that if you have a theme or a look or a message, a focus, that all of your communications should hang together in a unified fashion to support that look, that message, that theme. In other words, if you're consistently humorous in your pieces, it doesn't make sense to have a dark, brooding billboard that would not support your more humorous commercial spots, your more humorous jingles. So IMC is a very, very important communication. In a little bit, we'll look at sales promotions and talk about cause-related marketing. And so I just want to seg to that for a moment here and look at, a company like Lean Cuisine. If you think about all the different causes that they could support, it's an actually pretty long list. But who does Lean Cuisine appeal to? And if you're not sure, think about it in stark contrast to a calorie-laden frozen feast like Hungry Man, and you get the idea. So Lean Cuisine targets women primarily. So by virtue of that, they're very consistent. Their cause-related marketing, if you will, is to donate to breast cancer research. And their messaging is very, very coherent, very on target. So an example of the opposite of IMC would be if a McDonald's suddenly decided, we're going to make our restaurant green and blue just for fun. As everybody knows, they've got the Ronald McDonald colors because, once again, with IMC, they're very, very consistent. So we talked about the marketing mix being broken down into the 4 P's. You can break down the promotion mix, which is actually quite helpful to think about it. And the way you can break it down is advertising, personal selling, sales promotion, and public relations. Now, many years ago, advertising was such a big piece of the pie that the class that we had at LBCC devoted to the promotion mix was called advertising. Interestingly enough, because advertising is a smaller piece of the pie than in the past. We've even changed the name of the class to Marketing Communications to indicate the fact that the course covers more than just advertising, because sales, promotion, and public relations especially have become so important. And you might say, well, why is that? Well, a couple reasons. Number one is, how many advertising messages are you exposed to on a daily basis? And a lot of that you may not be aware of. You may be just driving down the street and start thinking about rabbits and not understand why, and not realize because you just went by a billboard that had a bunny on it. So if you paid attention to everything, it'd be overwhelming, because we get about 3,000 advertising messages per day, which is really astounding. Now, from our perspective as a consumer, I said a minute ago, it's overwhelming. Well, what about from the perspective of the marketer? How in the world does he or she break through all of that clutter to get the message through? Well, one of the ways they do it is relying more heavily on sales promotions or on public relations. So before we go further, let's define our terms. Advertising is a paid, non-personal message communicated to a select audience through a mass medium. And I would add to that it usually has an identified sponsor. In other words, if we see a Coke ad, we know that that's from Coca-Cola. You can subdivide advertising. Well, you can subdivide it a couple ways. So I'll mention one way to subdivide it. Primary advertising is for the product as a class. So when you see an ad like pork, the other white meat, that is not telling you to buy Hormel, although they hope that, rising tide raises all ships. If you start buying more pork, that you'll buy their brand. Selective demand advertising, on the other hand, is for a particular brand. So, quick example, would you term this as selective advertising or primary advertising? One more quick example, would you term this selective or primary advertising? And hopefully you identified the more generic got milk piece as primary demand advertising, and the one that showed the brand as selective demand advertising. Another common type of advertising is institutional advertising. Now, most of what we look at and think about is product advertising. However, when a company gets into trouble, and I said I wouldn't keep using United, but the face-to-face class clamored for another United example, so I'll throw one out there. So look at United Airlines. They got in huge trouble recently. When that happens, the customers stop thinking about the product or service, and they start thinking, okay, I'm really mad at the company. And actually, this does kind of tie in also with marketing, so I'll mention it. Recently, let me show you a spot that they tried to capitalize on recently, and it'll make the point a little better. Okay, there was a gentleman who, kind of entered into kind of a bet with Wendy's that if he got so many retweets, he would get free goodies from Wendy's. And so United thought they'd be cute and kind of jump on that. And they said, oh, we'll give you a free flight. And as you can see from the response, there were tons of responses, mocking United for that. So it's an interesting point that now United, even when they try to do something right, they get slammed because they've had so much bad publicity. So one of the things that United has had to do recently is they've had to improve their image. And this is where institutional advertising comes into play. I mentioned their outreach to current and past customers via email. They're now running ads saying, here's how we're going to be a better company. Other companies have had to do this in the past. If you think about oil companies that get criticized for damaging the environment, if that message becomes too loud, the consumer can't hear, oh, our gas treats your engine better than the competitor. What they hear is this is a bad company. And so when that happens, the firm has to engage in institutional advertising to sell you on the institution itself, to say, hey, we're the good guys. So regardless of the type of advertising undertaken, the first step, as we indicated previously, is to really clearly identify the target audience, to think about your objectives. And one of the steps, of course, is determining what the correct medium or media, if they're plural, for the campaign are. And as you can see, the different media have pros and cons. Television can add a certain dynamism. However, it's fairly expensive. Television's advantageous, on the other hand, because it reaches most people, but can be disadvantageous if you're going after a specific target. Let's say adolescents that are increasingly found online. So there are pros and cons to each, and I'll let you take a look at the slide to kind of think about what might or might not be appropriate depending on the product and depending on the objectives. So you can see a bit on the most effective advertisers. One of the choices is whether to do advertising in-house or whether to use an advertising agency. More and more there are certain specialty boutiques that are available. One of the big issues in advertising, of course, is legal considerations. This is actually one of my favorite topics. I won't get into it here. This is something that we cover at great length in marketing communications. But suffice it to say that you can get yourself into a world of trouble if you inadvertently get into things like deceptive advertising. So I'll just leave it for now as a topic you may wish to explore further in the future. Okay. So we mentioned the promotion mix. One element of that is personal selling. If you think about a product like life insurance, many of you have probably not bought life insurance yet, but once you get married and or have children, that becomes a lot more important, and you may find yourself the recipient of a phone call that goes something along the lines of, "Hi, my name's so-and-so, my friend or your friend Brad suggested I talk to you. I understand you just had a happy event. Let's kind of review some of your financial needs." And it's interesting because if you were buying a candy bar or a shirt, or some of the, the items we buy every day, you certainly wouldn't have somebody calling you up in a personal selling venture. So why is that so common in products like life insurance? Products like a house, buying a house for that matter, but not others. Well, if you stop and think about it, what do life insurance and houses have in common? Well, for one thing, they're both quite expensive. For another thing, they're both fairly complicated. If you get a life insurance quote, it's pages of numbers. There are lots and lots of options. You get term, you can get whole life, you can get universal, you can get variable, adjustable, lots and lots of options. The last thing I would add about life insurance is most people don't want to think about it, what it's ultimately for. So there are instances in which personnel selling can make a lot of sense. It's not used for most products because it's very expensive, regardless of how you pay the salesperson, whether it's through a salary or more commonly through a commission. It's certainly not cheap. So that's why it may make sense for some products, but not for others. So I won't belabor that point. But I do want to talk a bit about sales promotions. So let's say it's your last day of class. You're headed off to the beach and you think, gosh, I'd like to take some beverages with me. You stop by the convenience store and you notice that Pepsi has a 2-for-1 sale. And then you notice that Coke has an option where if you buy a 6-pack, you can get a novel to read at the beach. You go, wow, that's really great. Those are sales promotions, which are added incentives to get you to buy now. And those can take various forms. There could be an incentive, a sales promotion directed at the retailer to stock and push the product. Or they could be directed at the end consumer, as the examples that I just mentioned to you. Now, sales promotions could take a number of different forms. It could be a 2-for-1. It could be in-pack promotion where there's some goodie inside the package, an on-pack promotion, a premium offer, a contest, a sweepstakes. They do a lot of really good things for the brand. They might, as I said, might entice somebody to make a purchase they wouldn't otherwise purchase. They can also kind of add some sizzle, some excitement to the brand. And I mentioned a minute ago that you could do consumer promotions, the example that I just gave you, or trade promotions, where you're trying to encourage the wholesaler or retailer to stock and promote the item. And these are a few of the examples. And earlier I had mentioned cause-related marketing. Cause-related marketing is exceedingly common now. And that is the idea of tying your brand in with a particular worthwhile cause. Let me give you a quick example of a new one by Morton Salt. And what you saw in the ad were all the various charities that Morton Salt promotes, including the water. It's one that promotes safe drinking water. There was one with the guitars that promotes using instruments in blight, teaching kids instruments in blighted areas, etc. The ad was compelling enough that you might argue that it also falls into the fourth category of public relations. So public relations is maintaining positive relationships with all the various publics, and those could be customers, they could be government, they could be neighbors, they could be employees of a company. One of the biggest facets of public relations is publicity, or garnering positive mention of the company. Other options, of course, are event sponsorship that you see here. One of the challenges, of course, of public relations is dealing with crises. Here are some of the tools used by public relations. One of the most common tools, of course, is the news release, where the company details their exploits in writing and delivers it to